there any debate within the early church that the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul contradicted each other? In other words, were there any red letter only Christians back then?
Well, that's an interesting question on all sorts of levels. There was a very famous German scholar by the name of F.C. Bauer who argued that Christianity as we know it was actually not really the product of the teachings of Jesus, but really was the product of the Apostle Paul. So the real founder of Christianity, according to Bauer, was Paul and not Jesus. And so Bauer sort of retrospectively looks back at early Christianity and argues that Paul and Jesus would not have gotten along, right? That Paul took Jesus' pure religion and sort of, Hellenized it and made it about, sacrifice for sins and these sorts of things. Bauer's view has been widely refuted since, but he was one of the first ones that argued for a Jesus versus Paul narrative. It's not really that popular now, though, in modern scholarship. The more modern narrative now isn't Jesus versus Paul, but actually Peter versus Paul. And so now there's a narrative that there was different factions within the apostles themselves, and they particularly appeal to Galatians 2 when Peter and Paul were disagreeing and fighting with one another. And so that's where most of modern scholarship lies. So the F.C. Bauer theory has typically been debunked.
Paul, in the middle of his public career, so far as we know his public career, we don't know enough. There's a 10-year blank at the beginning when, after the flurry of activity after the Damascus Road, he's too hot to handle in Jerusalem, so they send him back to Tarsus, and we know nothing of what happened there. But from what we see thereafter, we can deduce quite a lot, so we have to probe into that. Then likewise, when he got to Rome, we don't know whether he came to trial and was killed then and there, whether he was released and made it to Spain, whether he made another journey back to the east. We simply don't. This is one of the frustrations about ancient history. There's a lot that we just don't know. And
Paul is a major figure in Western civilization. That is why it is worth trying to understand him completely. Secondly, of those 13 letters, there is a massive consensus in certain distinctions that seven of them pretty definitely come as original and authentic from Paul. Galatians and Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and 1st Thessalonians. Then there are various shades of agreement that 2nd Thessalonians possibly is not from Paul, Ephesians and Colossians is probably not from Paul, and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are almost certainly not from Paul. All of those are scholarly, more or less consensus.
Yes, did Paul accept James as the head of the first Christians?
Basically no, except if he happened to agree with Paul. No, because what happened at Antioch, after they had made the decision that yes, it was possible for Gentiles now to come into the Christian community without their males being circumcised, then the question came up, what are you going to do if you have Jewish Christians and pagan Christians in the same community celebrating the meal, which is the Lord's Supper? And either everyone or nobody observes kosher. The first way of doing it was nobody observes kosher, and James of Jerusalem said everyone observes kosher. And Paul called that hypocrisy, broke with James, broke with Peter, broke with Barnabas, and as I understand it, went west and never came back until he had to come back once to Jerusalem with the famous collection. So no.
When I read the Bible 40 years ago, Paul, the first writer of Jesus, didn't seem to know he existed. Why isn't this exploited more?
Well, of course, I think that's the strongest argument for the non-existence of Jesus. Now, Paul actually did believe Jesus existed. He thought he existed the same way Gabriel, Michael, and Satan existed as an archangel. He thought he was an actual archangel who actually was incarnated and actually was killed. But he thought, or at least according to the alternative theory for the origins of Christianity, Paul thought that this all occurred in another realm. It did not occur on Galilee, it did not occur on earth, and he was only known about it through secret messages sent by God through scriptures and through direct visions from Jesus. That's the alternative theory. when you read the epistles of Paul, it is weird that Paul does not know about a ministry for Christ, does not know about him being a miracle worker, does not know about him being an exorcist, does not know anything about parables being a method of teaching, never quotes the Gospels, never quotes Jesus except when he's quoting personal revelations that were given to him. Even, by the way, relates a two-way conversation he had with Jesus, a space Jesus, literally space Jesus, because he's up on Mars or Venus or wherever, the third heaven, which is literally another planet talking to Jesus. But anyway, that's in there. So we have him talking to space Jesus, but we never have Paul talking about anyone ever having met or seen Jesus in life. The first time Paul ever mentions anyone seeing Jesus is after his death. And I talk about all of this in On the Historicity of Jesus, chapter 11. The epistles of Paul are really the strongest argument for the non-existence of Jesus, because here we have documents written, about 20,000 words written within 2 decades of the origin of the religion, and they're so bizarre from the assumption that Jesus was such a charismatic man that he caused this following. You just don't see that in there. You see, what you see is a celestial angel revealing himself to people in dreams and hallucinations. To explore that further, you'd have to go to the book and read the literature that's in there and everything.